The console war between Sega and Nintendo has become one of the most significant events in gaming history, helping to shape the gaming landscape into what we know today. But before the clash of these Japanese giants, Atari once ruled the waves with their humble Atari VCS. While the dominance of these gaming companies is often thought of as separate chapters in gaming's illustrious past, what few people realize is that this globally recognizable brand came extremely close to distributing both the Nintendo Entertainment System and Sega Genesis alike. With all of this said, join me today as we revisit the bizarre instances in history whereby we nearly got an Atari Entertainment System as well as an Atari Genesis. Yes, this almost unbelievable series of events really happened. So without further ado, I am Lady Decade, and this is the story of how Atari almost changed gaming history twice. Let's set the scene. The year is 1981, and the gaming landscape vastly differs from what we have today. Atari continued their dominance over the home console market in North America. In contrast, as of the 31st of July that year, Nintendo began to have its first significant success in the world's largest video game market. This came in the form of the excellent Donkey Kong. This arcade hit, designed by the legendary Shigeru Miyamoto and produced by the fantastic Gunpei Yokoi, was unlike anything gamers had ever played. It broke new ground by using graphics as a means of characterization, even going as far as to include cutscenes to advance the game's plot and integrate the game's various stages. Going a step further in storytelling than Pac-Man before it, Donkey Kong would dominate the arcade market. Now, as we know, when a game makes bank in the arcade, the natural progression would be to release a home port or two of said game. And that is precisely what Nintendo intended to do. Of course, everyone under the sun wanted the rights to produce the Donkey Kong game, including Taito. Still, it would be the likes of Atari and Coleco that really interested Nintendo. Ultimately, Coleco would be awarded the rights to produce Donkey Kong cartridges on home consoles, along with all tabletop versions of the classic, due to Nintendo President Yamauchi believing they were the hungriest company. On the other hand, Atari was granted to develop home computer versions of the game, so Nintendo developed working relationships with both entities. Working with both video game giants maximised Nintendo's chances of further profiting from Donkey Kong's success, a plan that, to some degree, must have worked tremendously when we consider that 15 million copies of home console conversions were sold of the game. Still, Nintendo dreamed even bigger and wanted a home console hardware presence in the region. At the beginning of 1983, Nintendo released the 8-bit Famicom in Japan, a system that would quickly become the most popular game console in Japan's history. But to reach a maximum-sized audience before the system even being released, Nintendo had plans for this platform in the US. Could an 8-bit Nintendo console really break the already oversaturated US market? Well, does the Pope shit in the woods? As far back as 1980, Yamauchi had established Nintendo of America, a US-based company branch with Howard Lincoln functioning as vice president. This gentleman had been in regular contact with Atari due to Nintendo's desire to have Atari distribute the Famicom in the US. The reasoning behind this was that Atari already had several strong relationships working with various distribution chains, and Atari was a well-known and established gaming brand in the region. Furthermore, the Atari VCS, or 2600 as it would later be known, was an aging piece of hardware, and 1982's Atari 5200 was not the smash hit successor it had been intended to be. Atari had little to lose when negotiating with Nintendo, and a mutual agreement could be agreed upon that would benefit both parties. During '83, Howard Lincoln and then Nintendo President of America Minoru Arakawa would fly out to broker a deal with Atari. Much back and forth would occur, with Howard Lincoln eventually claiming to Atari that the president of Nintendo, Yamauchi, was losing his patience due to how long things were taking, with finally Ray Kassar, the Atari CEO, approving a deal. The Atari Entertainment System was on its way. Or was it? A draft deal from June of 1983 reveals that upon signing, Nintendo and Atari would begin a partnership whereby many terms and conditions would be set out and agreed upon, including the likes of minimum order requirements, delivery dates and other fees, and even granting Atari the distribution rights to create Famicoms in their own Atari shells and sell them in every country around the world outside of Japan. Other nuances had also been settled upon. These included allowing Atari the right to program for the system with the full assistance of Nintendo. A term of 4 years with a 3-year option of renewal had also been laid out. The deal was set to be signed during the Consumer Electronics Show of 1983, with the Chicago-based event functioning as the day the two companies would unite further. So, bearing this in mind, what could possibly go wrong? Well, one word I guess. Coleco. Atari and Coleco were fierce rivals in the console and home computer markets. As mentioned earlier, Atari held the license to produce Donkey Kong games for home computers, and Coleco had the license to be able to create Donkey Kong games for home consoles. During the trade show that year, they would demonstrate a version of Donkey Kong they had produced running on their Adam home computer, which would subsequently cause to hit the fan and all hell to break loose. Seeing Donkey Kong running on the Coleco Adam instantly bred distrust between Atari and Nintendo. Atari felt that Nintendo had double-crossed them by allowing Coleco to make a version of Donkey Kong that ran on a home computer. It is speculated that the success of Donkey Kong was one of the critical reasons that Atari was interested into going into business with Nintendo on a console in the first place. To see this at a trade show had them incensed and heavily questioning going ahead with working with the Japanese company. Now, what's rather interesting, and to muddy the waters further, is that the Adam could run Coleco's Donkey Kong because the hardware was compatible with all ColecoVision software and accessories. While Coleco had only ever produced home console versions of Donkey Kong, they later decided to manufacture a home computer capable of playing home console games. Perhaps they had found a legal loophole to get around their contract with Nintendo. Who knows? Apparently, until dealing with very angry communications with Atari, Yamauchi and Nintendo had no idea Coleco was doing this, let alone showcasing Donkey Kong on their computer at the Consumer Electronics Show. Yamauchi would reportedly give Coleco's Arnold Greenberg a rather strong talking to, with Coleco trying to justify the company's actions by explaining that the Adam looked like a home computer-like exterior with a video game-like console inside it, but to Nintendo, these were no more than excuses, perceiving that Coleco was trying to pull a fast one. After legal threats ensued, a compromise was eventually made that Coleco would no longer be allowed to use Donkey Kong to demonstrate the Adam's gaming capabilities, nor could it be used as a system pack-in game. But while the Coleco deal was indeed intact, the Atari-Nintendo deal was falling apart. Just 1 month after the CES, Ray Kassar, who spearheaded the Nintendo-Atari deal, would be fired from Atari following numerous accusations of insider trading. Further, the effects of the United States video game crash of 1983 were beginning to appear more and more apparent. Atari was laying off employee after employee and was hemorrhaging money. Many speculate that by the third quarter of 1983, Atari could no longer afford to make a deal with Nintendo. Following this period of chaos and turmoil for the US falling video game giant, by 1984, Warner Communications, who owned Atari, would sell the company to Jack Tramiel, the former owner of Commodore. As the dust began to settle, Nintendo would enter the US market in October 1985, with Super Mario Bros. Helping the Nintendo Entertainment System become the most popular game console in history, arguably eclipsing anything that Atari had managed to achieve previously. As for Atari in the home console market, they would return to the dance in May of 1986, releasing what was known as the Atari 7800 Pro system, with a marketing budget in the low millions compared to Nintendo's 16 million marketing budget. An argument could be made that the hardware was doomed to fail when put up against the NES. The Nintendo Entertainment System would end up controlling 80% of the North American console market, with all of Atari's home consoles combined only making up 12% of that generation. Things could have been a little different perhaps if it were not for the show that was 1983. However, many rumours have since circulated that Atari was only toying with Nintendo anyway to delay their US market entry while they worked on the 7800 and never intended to finalise a deal regardless. Regardless of your belief, this is a fascinating gaming story about a pivotal point in gaming history. It's interesting to see that before passing the torch in this era of US console gaming, the two companies at one point were negotiating to work on a console together, even if that pesky Coleco did throw a spanner in the works. Nintendo would not be the only company from Japan where Atari would end up in talks to distribute a game console. Later, a similar scenario would unfold whereby they would gain the opportunity to distribute the Sega Mega Drive in the United States. You know, the system they would later refer to as the Genesis. Before the Sega Genesis, we of course had the Sega Master System, a platform that sold great here in Europe and over in the vast land of Brazil. However, in the United States, things were not quite as rosy. Previously, Sega of America had repackaged the Sega SG-1000 Mark III as the Master System, much like Nintendo had done with the Famicom and NES before, with both efforts being designed to appeal to Western tastes. The Master System sold pretty poorly in its first year, which was in no way helped that Sega of America's marketing team only had 2 staff members. In 1987, a deal was made with the toy company Tonka, who would distribute the console going forward, a move that seemed to make sense to Sega of America, considering that the NES was being marketed as a toy. While the distribution of the Master System changed, this was not enough to make the platform a success in the North American market. If Sega were to make a splash in the region, significant changes would be needed to catch up with Nintendo. But how are they going to do so without plans for a certain blue hedgehog even conceived yet? This brings us to Dave Rosen, the man who set up Sega of America in the first place, functioning as the chairman of the US division of the company and in charge of all overseas operations. If Sega were to become the market leader in the region, they needed to work with a company that already had experience and, more importantly, a company that had Michael Katz as president of Atari's video game division. You see, under Katz's leadership, he had somewhat managed to turn things around in the company since the crash back in 1983, and everything was coming up Milhouse for Atari. While the NES had huge successes, the Atari Corporation released a redesigned model of the 2600 in 1986, supported by an ad campaign touting a price of under $50. With an extensive library of cartridges and a low price point, the 2600 continued to sell well into the late 1980s, with them even releasing games for it as late as 1989 and 1990, with titles such as Secret Quest and Fatal Run, for example. So while their newer 7800 consoles weren't doing great, their legacy hardware proved that Atari was still a strong enough gaming brand to generate consumer interest. In the book titled The Ultimate History of Video Games, Katz stated, Dave Rosen came to Atari and asked if we'd be interested in taking over the Genesis manufacturing, market and distribution. We came very close to making a hefty licensing deal so that Atari could jump into the 16-bit fray before Nintendo. As you can probably tell, this was a perfect opportunity for both companies to take advantage of. Atari desperately needed more powerful console hardware to capture players' hearts and imaginations. Sega felt they needed to work with people who were already proven highly competent distributors. Therefore, an Atari and Sega partnership made fantastic sense, with negotiations reportedly making it pretty far downstream. So, keeping all of this juicy information in mind, what would happen next in this bizarre gaming team-up? With the 16-bit console on the horizon, Atari reportedly began hiring staff members to work on the new Sega machine, with programmer Scott D. Williamson among these individuals. While other sources contest this story, in an old Atari Age forum post from 2011, he claims that Atari actually came up with the Genesis name. He stated, "We were originally hired to write games for the Tomahawk. That was the name that Sega gave their new Mega Drive system for North America. From what I know, Atari Vice President Larry Siegel had been brokering a deal where I believe Atari would be the North American, possibly worldwide, distributor for the system and its games. Sega was looking for an aggressive American name for the console. That's what led to the name Tomahawk, but we didn't like it very much. We had an office contest to see who could come up with a better name. I think the price was a steak dinner. Steve Rhino came up with the name Genesis, either as the console that would redefine gaming or after the effect in the Star Trek II movie. Either way, it stuck. The deal later fell through, and I don't know if Steve ever got his prize, but that's seriously how the Sega Genesis got its name. Whether this part of the deal is 100% accurate, multiple sources report that the negotiations between Sega and Atari certainly happened. So, with a deal that looked so beneficial to both parties, how could this one possibly fall apart? Well, no agreements were made, primarily down to the decisions of one person: Jack Tramiel. Jack Tramiel was an incredibly shrewd businessman who was notoriously tough to negotiate with. The founder and previous owner of Commodore International was considered by many to be a micromanager. Some have gone on record to state that he did not believe in budgets and wanted to personally approve every expense greater than $1,000. To say this man was tight-fisted would be the understatement of the century. Ahoy wrote that although Tramiel's obsession with controlling the cost of every phase of the manufacturing process had led to record profits during the home computer price war, his inflexible one-man rule had resulted in poor dealer relations and a steady turnover of top executives at Commodore. Leaving Commodore with him now owning the Atari Corp, he helped rejuvenate the company by using the remaining stock of game console inventory to keep the company afloat. At the same time, they finished developing the Atari ST home computers and range, which he intended to eat into Commodore's computer market share with. The historic nerd, who covered the Atari and Sega dealings on his channel in the past, caught up with Larry Siegel to get his take on all of this. The deal fell apart because the Tramiels were the Tramiels. Specific deal points may have been the excuse at the time, but the Tramiels were unlike any people I've ever known before or since. The Tramiels wanted the hardware, but anyone that knew them would have known making a deal with them would have been an insurmountable challenge. Management was hopeful but realistic. The programmers, like Scott, only heard the hype. It was never imminent. It went from cocktail chit-chat to discussions to negotiations, but floundered before the attorneys could screw it up. But still, the Genesis was an incredible system. So what was Tramiel's disinterest about? According to Mike Katz, this was mostly all down to money. Tramiel saw that distributing the Genesis to take on Nintendo's NES was too costly. He had far more interest in pumping cash into the Atari ST range to try and take over the home computer industry. After all, home computers were what Jack experienced at Commodore, with him wanting to continue that trend now with Atari. While no Atari-Sega distribution deal was ever finalised, the story doesn't end here, as there was one more twist to this tale which arguably helped the Sega Genesis become the success it was over in North America. It turns out that Mike Katz, spearheading Atari's game division, was so impressed with the Sega Genesis that just 1 year into the hardware's launch, he would jump ship and become the new president of Sega of America. He effectively became Jack Tramiel's competition in the home console market. In a Sega16.com interview, Katz stated, "The success of Genesis initially came from us having the personality licensing position for software. It was defensive and brilliant, if I do say so myself. We could not compete with the strength of Nintendo arcade licenses. So as a defensive move, we decided to get, for awareness, personalities. Montana, Pat Riley, Lasorda, Michael Jackson, Holyfield, develop good games around them and make the most of a tough competitive positioning / stance. Genesis does what Nintendo don't, which meant to the consumer more powerful hardware, 16-bit graphics / animation, and exclusive personalities that Nintendo couldn't claim to have. This was smart marketing, and as Howard Lincoln from Nintendo is quoted as saying, was that caused Mr. Arakawa, Nintendo of America's president, to admit privately had turned the tide towards Sega in 1991. The greatest console war had officially begun, with a former Atari employee at the Sega helm. Well, today the next Sega of America president, Tom Kalinske, is often given much of the credit for Sega's advantage in the console wars. The inventor of the marketing phrase, "Genesis does what Nintendo don't," Michael Katz, believes otherwise. He stated it irks him that subsequent Sega management has taken credit for many of his positive steps. He adds, "Competitive advertising / positioning has always been a strong weapon for me. I started as a brand manager at Lever Brothers, and we competed against Procter & Gamble with competitive advertising. Right after I became vice president of marketing at Coleco, we did the first ever 1979 competitive electronic games TV commercial against Mattel in the handheld game space. Coleco's Mr. Quarterback versus Mattel Football 1. Ironic because I started the handheld games line at Mattel. I had a history of seeing competitive commercials work when your product had a strong message / advantage versus competition. Against Nintendo, Genesis had a compelling product story, and we needed to raise hell / make noise with maximum awareness and a gutsy get in their face approach. I didn't talk to / fight with Sega Japan about it. I just told Dave Rosen that this is what we were going to do. I told the ad agency to execute on a competitive strategy, and the rest is history." Through all this, you can see the butterfly effect of Sega's dealings with Atari led to the Genesis does what Nintendo don't campaign, with Sega eventually becoming the market leader. Who knows what would have happened if history had unfolded a little differently, with Jack Tramiel greenlighting the distribution of the Atari Genesis. If you enjoyed this one, make sure you subscribe for regular weird gaming history, and check out this video right now covering the Atari NES. See you soon.